So, you know, if you feel free to interject, ask me a question, query, whatever, you know, even challenge me. This is the whole point. This is what it's all about. Essentially, this is a challenge. This is a challenge to what we are used to, a centralized financial system. And maybe you guys can tell me what that looks like. What is this traditional world of finance that we live in? How is it structured? What is this world that we live in? What do you think a centralized financial system is? Sorry. Oligopoly. Now, that's an interesting political choice of words. But technically, what we're talking about is a system full of intermediaries, where the system relies upon those intermediaries. And for a number of different reasons, they rely upon those intermediaries. One of the most important reasons is to hold custody of your funds, first. Secondly, to report on transactions within that financial system up the chain to the regulator. So there's this idea of delegating law enforcement to intermediaries, which is an interesting concept because if you think about it, the intermediary, all it wants to do is provide a service, but is now wrapped in to doing law enforcement for the government. So this is the centralized financial system that we live in. Now, the reality is, since 2009, we have made a success of creating a decentralized financial system, which is, of course, Bitcoin. Is the first success story of a decentralized peer-to-peer financial system. It is a financial system de facto because you can make a transaction from one person to another, and it's a financial transaction. Now, of course, you can use it for other means, and we are exploring that with, you know, counterparty, all sorts of 2.0 technology. So, let me just elaborate. The traditional financial world, centralized. This works. The intermediaries are fundamental to the operation of the system. So the biggest intermediary within the centralized system is the bank. The bank holds custody of your funds, and they're instrumental in moving those funds. Did you actually know that when you make a transaction, you are actually implicitly making a transaction, but it requires the consent of the bank to make that transaction? That your funds that you deposit with the bank, you do not control, in effect. You have rights over, but you do not control. And thus the difference between a centralized and decentralized system, because in the decentralized financial system, I control my funds. Now, with this new paradigm comes responsibility, because the problem is within our society, as we know, most people don't want to take that responsibility. If you are rich and you have funds, what you want to know is that they are safe. And maybe you don't even trust yourself. That's why you pass it on to a custodian, because if they lose your funds, then you will sue them. And then the government sits behind and provides a deposit guarantee. And that is how the system works. In a decentralized model, where there's peer-to-peer, you have no one else but yourself to blame when you lose your bitcoins. And that is a very difficult, bitter pill to take in a decentralized financial system. Now, what's going to be interesting as we move forwards in this world, and this world is a dual world, one which is centralized and one which is decentralized. And I believe that they will be working together, that there will be a crossover between the two, and that on this side, in the decentralized world, we're going to have to recreate a system that is compliant, that is not just used for the Silk Road, that goes beyond that. And I mean, Ethereum is that next step, is that evolution of the decentralized world. So this is the really interesting point, because if you have a centralized system that relies upon intermediaries, and that is the status quo, then all of the laws that are created, the policies that are created at the higher level from intergovernmental bodies such as, FATFA, which created the 41 recommendations that became AML laws across the world, they are built with intermediaries in mind. They are built on a centralized model. And they're built on that centralized model because there's the reliance of this delegation of law enforcement to those intermediaries. That the banks, every time they send a transaction from one person to the next, they need to report on the originator and the beneficiary. And they need to know that when that transaction goes from A to B, that transaction has been sanction monitored. So that anyone heard of like Standard Chartered got fined, HSBC got fined. All of these banks were getting fined because they were dissimulating the information. They were trying to break up the connection between the originator and the beneficiary, which was in breach of the Patriot Act, and that originated from FATFA. So the obligations of these intermediaries is to carry out the role of law enforcement. And law enforcement derives from laws, policies, which are built with these intermediaries in mind. So the proof that we are in a centralized financial system is that over 97% of all money is held by banks and intermediaries. The only bearer instrument that you are probably aware of, unless you have bearer bonds at home, is the cash that you have in your pocket. It's probably the only bearer instrument that you have been familiar with or have been exposed to. And what is a bearer instrument? A bearer instrument is fascinating, in my opinion, because title in the instrument relies upon possession. So if I have cash in my pocket and I hand it to this gentleman here, he now is the possessor of that cash, that bearer instrument. And he can present it to Eve over there, and now Eve is the possessor of that cash. Legal title is being transferred amongst us just by mere possession. And that is totally adverse to the current financial system. Why? Because when you make a transaction through a bank, the bank knows who the originator is and knows who the beneficiary is. If I make a transaction with this gentleman in cash, no one really knows about it. It's almost anonymous. Yet, the transaction is legally valid. The possession is passing over. He now has that instrument which he can present to this gentleman over there and to that gentleman over there, and it can pass around within the economy. And that is not acceptable. That's why cash is really representing only 1%, 2% of the financial system as we know it today. And bearer instruments are a target of FATFA, of policymakers, because they know that it could be used for anonymous transactions. It could be used, for example, for money laundering. Why is it that there are limitations on how much cash you can move from one country to the next? Because it's a bearer instrument, simple as. And Bitcoin is the digital bearer instrument. So can you imagine what policymakers feel about Bitcoin? When 1% of the financial system is cash, bearer instrument, and now they've got Bitcoin to deal with. Try and switch the slide. So let's look at the traditional regulatory paradigm and the role of regulators. Now this may seem abstract, but the idea is to be able to see both systems in parallel. The regulators, they are given the job to monitor markets. So they need to assess where the risk is within the market. For example, any market manipulation, insider dealing, all of the rest of it. they can't know if someone is actually committing some kind of offense in relation to the market if they don't know what is happening within the market. But they're not there on the stock exchange. The FCA, LSE, they're not there where the action is happening. So they rely upon the intermediaries to report the information about what's happening in the markets. This is typically information that's being pushed. So based on this reliance model and based on the intermediaries pushing the information, the regulator can now perform their function. So they receive the information, they analyze it. Are there any anomalies? If so, they intervene. So how else do they perform their role? And what else is their role? Their role is based around conduct principles and competence in systems. So they will say, okay, so you want a license as a broker. You want to be an MTF. You want to be a market of your own. You want to be regulated. You prove to us that you can adhere to our conduct principles, these human standards of conduct. Plus, we want to see your systems, and we want to know that your governance, etc., that you're competent enough to run that regulated business. So it's this idea of passing on a standard to the regulated entity and then ensuring at the point when the license has been issued that they would adhere to that standard. And then, as we were referring to before, their role is to delegate the law enforcement to the intermediaries. So it's all based on this idea of push information. So AML is a fascinating one. I don't know if you heard, but Ripple Labs just got fined $700,000 for not reporting a suspicious activity. Ripple Labs, creator of a protocol and the XRP currency, are getting fined by FinCEN in the United States for not reporting a transaction. Now, let me tell you about that transaction. They were dealing with a person in Malaysia who had a personal account. And that person in Malaysia informed Ripple Labs that they were using their personal account for business purposes. Ripple Labs said, oh, well, we can't accept the trade. But they did not report the transaction to FinCEN. And for that simple error of not reporting the transaction, they're now fined $700,000. And reputationally, it's a disaster. But it's all based around this concept, push information and delegating law enforcement. These intermediaries, the Patriot Act and all of these laws are set up so that the information gets pushed up. And then, there's a valid, it sounds like I'm criticizing it, but the idea here is that if the regulator knows the financial transactions that are happening at a national level, and through the intermediaries who are closer to the action, they can now coordinate internationally to combat anti-money laundering, terrorism finance, and all the rest of it. It requires collecting information at the grassroots, bringing it up, and coordinating internationally. So there's a whole problem with the system. And we know it because we read the papers. So the first big problem is if you rely upon push, then who is pushing the information? You have to rely upon that intermediary. Now, they may be licensed, and you say, you've audited them and all the rest of it, and then given them the license, but they're still human beings. And human beings, by their very nature, are inaccurate. We all make mistakes. Or deliberately misleading. LIBOR is a perfect example. So, in instances, if there's a conflict of interest between my business and what I am reporting to the regulator, then am I going to, make it a little bit softer, the report, choose certain language, pass it on to my lawyer to change the report slightly? There's an inherent conflict with reliance on intermediaries. And then, if you want to shake up the intermediaries and make sure that they're doing this and that they're cooperating with the regulator, then you audit them. You get there, you go into their place. It's called the Arrow investigation. If you've ever been in work for an FCA firm, if you say you're going to be investigated and you're going to have an hour investigation, you're in deep shit. It means 2 weeks, you're going to have FCA officers in your office going through files and meticulously pulling out anything that looks a little bit dodgy. So let's look at another paradigm, if we can. So decentralized financial world. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, if in a centralized financial world, you're essentially passing custody of all of your assets to a third party, the intermediary. In this decentralized financial world, intermediaries are not that important. You know, I mean, yeah, like how many people know how to secure their Bitcoin private keys correctly? I mean, even Mycelium and all the rest of them are trying to explore ways of securing private keys in a way that's foolproof. But intermediaries inherently are not that important. People will be, in this world, taking possession of their own assets and responsibility for those own assets, or they'll be operating with software providers that will at least minimize the risk that they will lose their assets. So an example might be, BitGo, okay? So you go to a bank, you deposit your assets and all the rest of it, and you have the deposit guarantee, which makes you feel fuzzy inside. But then you can have the same with BitGo. You deposit your assets with BitGo, you still have your private keys, however, so you actually own your assets, and they provide you insurance. So I'm not sure what the difference is. So this is the interesting way that the decentralized world will evolve, i.e., what will be the role of intermediaries when everyone's looking after their own assets? And in this decentralized world, you have peer-to-peer transactions. So as we said, you're not going through a bank to someone else. This is peer-to-peer purely. Thus, it's a nightmare for regulators because they have no way of tracking where these transactions are coming from and going to. And as I said, individuals hold their own assets. So what's the risk here for a regulator? Well, the risk is, of course, they can't rely on the intermediaries to obtain that market information. And so, they can't, say to the intermediary, well, can you tell me what transactions have gone through you? Well, actually, not everyone is using BitReserve or Circle or Coinbase. People who just got their own wallets and transacting between them. So Circle can't really tell me, if I've got a blockchain.info wallet, what I'm doing with my wallet. So the role of intermediaries is becoming less important, and thus meaning the market information is now being reduced, and their role reduced. Law enforcement becomes an absolute nightmare because you've got peer-to-peer transactions, therefore every transaction is not being sanction monitored, which is just a nightmare. And then you have the beautiful bearer instrument of Bitcoin, which is a huge risk for money laundering for regulators. But now, let's change the tone a little bit. Talk about the risks. Let's talk about the opportunities for regulators. I mean, let's talk about the financial crisis. One of the key components was the regulators weren't able to identify the transactions that were happening outside of the financial system, shadow banking and all the rest of it. And now the tendency with regulation now is to bring all of these over-the-counter transactions into the financial system. So over the next 5 to 10 years, every single transaction is going to need to go through a regulated exchange. But there's a limit to what a regulator can do. And also, if we go back to the point about push reporting, if I push a report from Estonia and one from Germany and one from the UK, we've got different languages, different cultures, different ways of doing things. Even from an accounting perspective, we try to standardize accounting, but people do things in different ways. Thus, if you are the regulator and you're monitoring the whole thing, well, there's a lot of inconsistency across the board. How are you going to interpret these different reports? And how much time are you going to spend just trying to create consistency across the board. So when we sat down with the Bank of England and talked to them about the blockchain, they started getting excited because the blockchain suddenly creates this standardization. The standardization where they can draw information from the blockchain. They don't need to go to the intermediary and ask for information. They just go, oh, this one place where I can get all the information. They love it. So blockchain monitoring. So if you have Bitcoin, you have a blockchain. If you have a currency, Ethereum, whatever, you still have a blockchain, a way that you can monitor what's happening. Now, of course, you can't monitor market information by just looking at raw data. You need to interact with the intermediaries within that decentralized model. So they'll provide you with addresses, and then those addresses will correlate to your transaction monitoring on the blockchain. So we're moving, therefore, in a decentralized model from push information to pull information, meaning the regulator doesn't need the intermediary anymore. In fact, don't tell me anything. I don't want you to tell me anything. I will find out myself, and I will monitor you through the blockchain. And then when it comes to international coordination, which is one of the premises of anti-money laundering, international coordination plus anti-terrorism financing, the blockchain is wonderful because everyone speaks the same language on the blockchain. Interpol can work with the UK regulators. Interpol can interoperate with anyone because they're only dealing with one data set. So there are huge efficiencies in this sense. And this is just an example of where things could go. So capital reserve. If you want to open a regulated institution today, what's going to happen is they're going to say, well, what risk do you pose to the financial system? You know, a bank. What happens if a bank implodes? Well, people lose their money. Sorry? We bail them out. Yeah, that is actually the case. But, you know, the idea of a capital reserve is so that we shouldn't bail them out. Doesn't really work that well. But the capital reserve is saying, okay, you're a regulated financial institution. We'll assess the amount of risk that you pose for the financial services industry. And then we'll say, okay, well, you pose about £1 million worth of risk. You take £1 million and you put it into a bank that you cannot touch and no one can touch. That's the role of the capital reserve. It means if you blow up, these funds are safe for your creditors, i.e. the deposit holders and all the rest of it. So it's to ensure against default, bankruptcy. Now, if you have a blockchain business in a decentralized world, it's inherently more transparent if it's literally running on the blockchain. You can, regulator, just have a look, check their accounts, check the blockchain. It's all there. And none of that can change. You can't get some guy coming in the middle of the night and burning some records. It's all there. You delete it, impossible. And then governance. Look, blockchain business from the point of view of governance, i.e. who can do what within that, that can be programmed to a certain extent. There can be controls around who can do what inherent within the business, as in you take the articles of association of the business, convert it into code, and put it on the blockchain. Then the client assets. So one of the big issues for regulated institutions is what are you doing with client assets? You put an application through to the FCA, the first question they'll ask you is, where's your safeguarding account? Where is it held? We want the letter from the bank to confirm that it is truly a safeguarding account and that the bank can't use the account in case you're in default on a loan. So client assets sucks in the centralized world. But in a decentralized world, the government or the regulator can monitor it via the blockchain. You know, every quarter, you have to send a report to the FCA to tell them how much you are holding in your safeguarding account and that that amount hasn't been reduced for some unknown reason. In this instance, the government can actually just check, or the regulator can just check. And you could install controls that makes it impossible to move that money to anyone without the client's consent. So in a sense, the client asset requirements, etc., just becomes redundant. So what you will see, and this is, I think, how things will evolve in the decentralized financial system as it starts to become accepted by the centralized one, is that capital reserves will become less of a requirement. Once you start to build the regulator with familiarity with the technology, they start to understand its power, and that they see the proof in the pudding, i.e. people operating not too many more Mt. Goxes, but people operating using the technology to ensure governance, to ensure protection of client assets. Then they'll say, oh, well, this is actually better than our system. Maybe we'll rely upon it. So how do we take this one step further? In a way that regulators, that they would actually open their arms to the decentralized financial system. Well, if you tell them that you can remote freeze an address, well, they're going to get excited about that. When they know that, oh, so this guy here, oh, he's based in Iran, freezes address. They can't do that today. Oh, you want to shut down someone's account based in Panama because they're Iranian? Oh, well, okay, right. So how do I go about doing that? First of all, I go to maybe FBI, some law enforcement. I need a prosecutor, commences an action. I need a judge's order. And then I need to execute that judge's order internationally in Panama. And then the bank in Panama needs to cooperate with me and all the rest of it. It's long, it's cumbersome, and it's expensive. Remote freezing, done in a second. So, I mean, I don't want to give Bank of England regulators too many ideas, but the point is, decentralized models, even though at the beginning people are afraid of them because of bare instrument, actually it's like hyper-compliance. And so you'll see that as they start to understand the technology, they will internalize the technology and the Bank of England will issue their own sterling coin, and then game over. And then we've got this interesting idea around compliance programmation. So, sanction monitoring is a pain, right, for these banks. Every single transaction, sanction monitored, sanction monitored, sanction monitored. I mean, it's all API'd and the rest of it, and they're just bots doing this. But they're all centralized. But in a decentralized model, it doesn't really work. But what if in that decentralized model, you had DAOs or whatever, a program operating on that blockchain that made it a requirement for transaction A to transaction B or A to B, that it has to be transaction monitored for it to go through. And that can be done with a multi-sig or something like that. So compliance programmation becomes a possibility now in the decentralized world. And I think this slide will... I think that's it, but I want to just give a perspective. The perspective is that 2009 spells the beginning of a decentralized financial system. We now know it is here to stay. You guys know it's here to stay because you're sitting in this room on a Friday night. So this decentralized world that will emerge, evolve, and continue is going to sit parallel to the centralized one. And there's going to be a crossover between the two. So what is going to be interesting is the dialogue between the decentralized world and the centralized one, and bringing the centralized one over to this side. And that will eventually happen in many ways. I was at an event hosted by UBS talking to them about regulation, compliance, the blockchain. And they were like talking, and there's like some execs in the room, and the thing that they were interested in was reducing costs. replacing a back office with a blockchain and the rest of it. But this is just the beginning. They take the blockchain and they put it in their back office. Then they see the opportunity for other things. And this is a gradual process to actually becoming more and more decentralized. So I think, you know, Ethereum and everything that it's about is basically creating that opportunity to develop all of these different ideas. But then what's going to happen is that the centralized world is going to move into that world. You know, it's going to take those opportunities, take that inspiration, and apply it to their own. So I'm happy to take questions.
Got one here.
So we've had a lot of talks tonight about how decentralization means removing the big brother from spying on you. We've had early Bitcoiners all very pro sort of liberty, not having the banks all spying on you. Do you think that in reality Bitcoin has created what the early Bitcoiners would call a monster who's now going to come back and bite their head off?
Yeah. You know, this is the funny thing. You have no idea what this technology will do and who will adopt it. The reality is, if we just go back a couple of slides and you have remote freezing of someone's assets, that's kind of going against the principle of Bitcoin in the first place. And I think if that's what you're referring to, I think that's the cycle that will happen. But I do think there is nothing that we can do about the truly decentralized systems. And those
people always have a choice to use Ethercoin or Bitcoin.
That's right. That's right. So you'll have that decentralized model that will run, and then you'll have the centralized versions, which will be, I would say, like franchise models, where they will control the networks, etc. But they will use what has been created over here. They will redeploy it over here. Sterling coin over a private network distributed blockchain. It's taking all the inspiration here, but applying it over here.
So there's going to be a big conflict between the banks and the the Bitcoin decentralized and the bank decentralized world.
Yeah, but bear in mind, you guys, it's all you're creating is open source. They're just tapping into it. But the great thing is, and this is an interesting point. When you take the technology and you use it, then it's almost like you're building from, you have to kind of accept this side of the equation as well, because it's part of you. So it creates a level of acceptance. And, you know, I think what you'll see is, I mean, from a practical perspective, is how, you know, banks deal with Bitcoin, a bearer instrument and all the rest of it. Well, we're creating tools today that allow you to, you know, taint addresses and all the rest of it and do the transaction monitoring that you would normally expect for any regulated business. And so banks are having to see, well, this is not completely anonymous, etc. So even the decentralized world in its entirety can interact with the centralized one, and we're building that bridge. But I do think it's just going to be pick and mix. They will go in, grab what they can do in terms of tools, and redeploy them in a more controlled fashion.
Next question.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about the main issue that I see with the present financial system is that it's the high street banks who have created 97% of the money supply. And the Bank of England has very little, if any, kind of control over creating money. And it's been this way since money went electronic in about 1981 or whatever. Now that seems to be the biggest issue as to how we've ended up in this mess at the moment. And money creation, or the creation of value, in fact, seems to be the most interesting thing that's coming out with Bitcoin or with any cryptocurrency that's coming next. In terms of if anybody can mine, which is what's going to happen with Ethereum, then we can all actually have, we'll all have part in creating the value of the currency that's there, whereby we will not be reliant on the banks anymore and they will lose their power in that sense. Have you got anything to comment on that?
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I spend like weeks thinking about different things. And one of the things I've been thinking about the past couple of weeks is Bitcoin as a commodity, and a commodity that we are familiar with, which is gold. you know, and I mean, people always like saying, okay, it's digital gold, but think about it a second. The gold supply has increased by 1% a year or something like that, yeah? You know, and with Bitcoin, it's all predefined in terms of the supply increase and the inflationary cycles. And I mean, the problem with Bitcoin, of course, is consolidation. And, you know, with gold mining, not everyone can participate in that. Maybe in the gold rush in the beginning, you could get, you know, do a bit of digging and try and make it rich. And that's the same with Bitcoin. Everyone started in the beginning, and then it consolidated, and no one could do it without the industrial power. But as we start to make advances in algos, you know, what Ethereum exploring with going from proof of work to proof of stake, and other systems that are reputation-based where nodes have to operate, you know, that they have a role within the system, the nodes, and that they can mine, then, yeah, individuals will partake in the creation of commodities. And that is absolutely fascinating. We're individuals creating commodities which are then used as currencies. And what I find amazing about cryptocurrency, when I say strictly cryptocurrency, is that the value of it is in itself. And that's it. You know, there are tethers, there are people that are referencing other assets, are using the blockchain, but the value of this digital currency is in itself, and that is fascinating. The community that supports it, a payment system, an economy. And you know, the idea of bit shares was, well, if you have a Bitcoin, you have a share in the network, you know. So I think the inclusion aspect is pretty fascinating, and and access to creation of commodities, and therefore participating in currency exchange.
But if you can create a cryptocurrency in 6 lines of code, and I could create one, and then anybody else can create one using the same source code, just shifting it about a little bit, then in terms of Sterling coin or UBS coin or even Barclays coin or whatever like that, it's kind of the value has to change somewhere, because if anybody can do it, it means that the Bank of England, even if they create it, it's running on a similar system, a similar blockchain. It's got, depending on, I just don't see how, I don't see how the banks will maintain that much power over money as a whole when it enters this space on a much grander scale.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I was trying to be controversial. It's a UBS thing. I said, look, you guys have absolutely zero access to the undeveloped world. You know, they say, how many bank branches do you have in India? They had 0. You know, and people who are accessing those markets now are telecoms providers. You know, because mobile money created, you know, the first success story was, of course, M-Pesa and the rest of it. Now mobile money operators are competing with banks, and banks' role, you know, where is the world's population? It's China and India, yeah? Pretty much. Yet they don't really have penetration into those markets to the degree that they wouldn't. I mean, the standard banks that we know, especially in India. And so digital currency in an instant creates the ability to access anyone with an internet connection. So they know that is going to be a challenge, but that's something that they can embrace. I.e., if they want to compete with the mobile operators, they can either set up their own mobile network, which they're not going to do, open their own branches, or issue their own digital currency. So I wouldn't underestimate their intent to compete within this market as it starts to become a success. At the moment, yeah, it's pretty minor at the moment. People are looking at it saying, oh, it's interesting in terms of blockchain technology, but they're not viewing digital currency itself as a challenge to their financial system. When the curve starts to mount, then at that point they'll be making decisions to dominate the space.
Cool. Next question over here.
Hi, Adam. Do you think that some of these more interesting consensus algorithms that are coming in proof of stake will find their way into the sort of politics and legislation of money? And I'm thinking, for example, a lot of people wouldn't be very happy about the US dominating the payment rails as they do at the moment. And an organization like FATF is not technically dominated by the US. I mean, they could apply consensus algorithms to stop or to make the sanctions world work in a more consensual basis rather than just the US deciding that that's how sanctions are going to work?
Yeah, I mean, well, FATFA, the difference is about enforcement. Basically, the US is a bit hotter on enforcement than any other jurisdiction, but the US is essentially enforcing a recommendation that's coming from FATFA. Like, for example, the requirement for an originator and beneficiary of every transaction. That is a requirement that actually stems from FATFA, but it's just that the US is hot on that and enforcing it and making sure that any dollar transaction complies with it.
I would say things like sanctions. I mean, sanctions against, say, WikiLeaks don't really come from FATFA, or sanctions against
So bilateral.
Snowden or so on. You know, I mean, they're sort of unilateral sanctions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, as long as you are using the US dollar, you are subject to US jurisdiction. Full stop. And so, if you are in a digital currency world, then just, I mean, you know, the movement will be away from the US dollar, away from US jurisdiction. And to be honest, it's very difficult to escape that jurisdiction. And, you know, like, for example, I advise startups, and they're saying, okay, well, I want to set up a Bitcoin exchange, and yeah, I'm looking forward to getting access to the US market. And I'm like, no. You know, it's as simple as that. And, you know, the Ripple fine is just an example of that. You know, what you're asking is a more deeper question about global hegemony.
Next question over here.
Cheers. Not my question, just pick up on that there is an angle for the US dollar if things do start being traded on it, like oil, for example, that it does give them a leverage into a market that might be expanding. But anyway, my question was more on, obviously we can use Bitcoin, etc., to move funds, etc. What discussions you had with banks and financial bodies in terms of fractional reserving model and how money itself is going to be generated and how they can leverage that, or are they just looking purely at the transaction, person-to-person transactions?
So how banks see the opportunity?
Well, you can't create the money from nowhere in the same way you can with obviously financial products, like whatever you want to call them.
Yep.
You can't suddenly go and mine millions of items because it just doesn't work that way. So how are they approaching that problem, or are they just purely seeing it as a way to move funds between bodies?
To be honest, I think, as I said, like for the banks, they're more interested in the back office. The second tier and third tier banks maybe would be interested in payment rails, but to be honest, they're not looking at this like, okay, well, we're going to embrace digital currency for themselves. You know, BBVA, one of the most innovative banks in Europe, made an investment in Coinbase and has an innovation lab that's looking into the blockchain. But the reality is, let's be honest, they don't really see the threat from digital currency at the moment. So they're not going to embrace it themselves.
Thanks. So first of all, like some comments on Twitter. There's a guy who was saying that you should be on CNN so that the regulator would finally listen.
That's right. We're going to be on CNBC. We're doing a Greek thing, Greek coin. You should check it out. Introducing a digital currency to Greece.
And then the second thing was, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned this idea of being able to freeze asset. That seems to be something they get really excited about. Obviously, myself, I'm personally completely opposed to any way of centralizing lead control, this type of platform. But how about having contracts that represent banks, and these contracts would have backdoors, quite simply, just a piece of code that says, if this is a regulator that comes knocking, then do this or do that. So give them sort of admin control over the banks. The banks would be forced to use those contracts, because if they try to use another contract on the blockchain or off-chain, then I'm sure that can be found out in their accounts. Do you think it's a valid use of the technology without necessarily introducing centralizing element to it?
Wow. Yeah, but the code is open source. Everyone sees the backdoor.
Yeah, that's right. So everybody knows only the regulator has access.
I mean, from a data protection point of view, to know that, and it's hard-coded, it's a very interesting way forwards. The thing is, I mean, I like to think ahead and be futuristic, but that kind of conversation would come after the conversation of, you know, how do you deal with a decentralized financial system? What is it? That's the first question for them. But I think hard coding banks onto a blockchain with a backdoor that everyone can see is the ultimate form of transparency.
Right, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.